Hi, I'm Jay Nordlinger with the Human Parade. We're in Haverford, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia, in the home of a preeminent scholar. He's been called the Dean of Middle East Scholars, or Historians. He is, of course, Professor Bernard Lewis. Professor Lewis was born in London during a dark time for his country, the First World War. When the Second War came, he served in it, in intelligence. In what capacity specifically, I'm not too sure. Professor Lewis has never been gabby about that sort of thing. He started studying Middle Eastern languages when he was an adolescent. He never stopped studying. He has written a slew of books and has met and talked with pretty much everyone who has mattered. He has spent much of his career at Princeton, here in good old America. For decades, we knew Professor Lewis as the man who knew as much about the Middle East and the Muslim world as anybody. This knowledge became especially vital after 9/11 and the launch of what we used to call the War on Terror, and some of us still do. Everyone's an expert on the Middle East now, or thinks he is. Our guest today is a genuine one. Thanks for having us, Professor Lewis.
Thank you for inviting me.
Did you ever think that your field would be so important to the world at large, and that your knowledge would be as much in demand as it is today?
No, I didn't. Fortunately, the first question you asked me is one to which I can give a clear, simple, and direct answer. I can't promise this for the rest.
It's as though you had been preparing for decades to explain this last decade to people in general. Everyone wants to know about Islam. Is it compatible with democracy? Will we ever get along? Does it annoy you a little to see lots of people on television and in the newspapers pronouncing on the Middle East?
Oh yes, it annoys me a great deal. I see a lot of people, including people from the Middle East, talking a lot of arrant nonsense. But that's normal, isn't it?
Yes. What have been some of the main errors that people make about the Middle East and the Muslim world?
Well, the main errors are the generalizations. Generalizations are almost always wrong. I mean, the people who tell us, on the one hand, that Islam is incompatible with democracy, and the people who tell us, on the other hand, that Islam is the only true democracy. I won't go along with either of those propositions.
Mm-hmm. I've heard you say that, that there is a view that Arabs can never have democracy, can never have human rights, can never liberalize. They're sort of born to live under dictatorship, and that's called the pro-Arab view.
Yes, that is not, of course, a pro-Arab view. It's a very anti-Arab view, and I think it is based on a misreading of the Arab and more generally of the Middle Eastern Islamic past. What I think people fail to realize is that the kind of autocratic dictatorial government which now prevails in most Middle Eastern countries is a result of modernization. It did not exist before modernization. I'm not saying that they had democracy as we understand that word in the West, but they did have limited, responsible government. A remark which I have often quoted, I hope you'll forgive me if I quote it again.
Please.
A few years before the French Revolution, the French ambassador in Istanbul received a letter from his government in Paris complaining that he was making slow progress with his negotiations. And he wrote back, and I find this quite memorable, coming from a French ambassador. He said, here, meaning here in the Middle East, he said, here it is not like in France, where the king is sole master and does what he pleases. Here the Sultan has to consult. He has to consult with all sorts of different groups of people. And this is literally true. The authorities had to consult with all kinds of organizations where authority came from inside and not from above.
You've spent a lot of time in Turkey, I know. Is Turkey going in the wrong direction, as many people say? Is it headed into a kind of Islamism?
It's not clear at the moment. It could be that, or it might not be. Certainly there have been changes for the worse in Turkey in recent years. I mean, for a long time, Turkey was the most hopeful country in the Islamic world. It was the first which developed a real democracy. I was there in Turkey at the time in the year 1950. It is one of my most vivid recollections. For the first time, they had a free and fair general election in which the government was defeated, withdrew from power and handed over to the opposition. It was really a memorable event, and as I say, entirely without precedent in the history of the Middle East. Unfortunately, it's not only without precedent, but without many examples to follow. But there have been some, and I think it was a very important precedent. And in that respect, I say, Turkey set a very good example to the rest. Now, latterly, there have been some changes in Turkey, and it's not quite clear which way things are going.
I want to go back to the origins, not of the Middle East, but of you. You were a Londoner.
I was born in London, in the same bed, in the same house where my mother was born 21 years and 3 weeks earlier.
And how did the Middle East happen to catch your eye? Why the Middle East?
Well, by two different routes. One of them was that from my childhood, I was always interested in hearing the other side. I learned English history at school. We spent a lot of time in English schools learning history. And English history, until the beginning of the 19th century, consisted very largely of wars with the French. And at one point I thought, I'd like to know the French side of this.
Yeah.
So I asked my father if he could find me a history of France in English. At that time I couldn't read French. And he did. He found me a history of France, and I read a French history of France, and had got the thing from the French point of view. Well then, as I went on with my normal history study at school, I had to do the Crusades and the Eastern Question. And again, I thought I'd like to know what this looks like from the other side. And this gradually led me into the study of Middle Eastern societies, trying to find out what the Crusades looked like from the side of the Saracens, what the Middle Eastern question looked like from the side of the Ottomans. Now, I had some help in this, in that at the same time, I was being prepared for my bar mitzvah. Do I need to explain that?
No.
Thank you. I was being prepared for my bar mitzvah.
Well, so you were 12 then, during this
12,
preparation?
Yes. Now, normally, that meant that one learned enough Hebrew script to be able to read it aloud.
And then forget it forever.
And read the portion which was assigned for one's bar mitzvah. For me, it was a fascinating discovery. As I said, I was fascinated by languages and history. This was a new language and a new set of history. And to the utter astonishment of my family, after I had completed my bar mitzvah, I asked if I could continue with my Hebrew teacher. My great good fortune was that my Hebrew teacher was a scholar and an intellectual, and a man who could respond to my childish enthusiasm. So he helped guide me to the study of Hebrew, and that led to Aramaic and to Arabic. So that was the other direction from which I came into Middle Eastern studies. Now, of course, it had never occurred to me that one could actually earn a living by doing that sort of thing. The family decision was that I would be a lawyer, and I was willing to go along with that. So, as was the normal practice, I went to university to take a BA degree in what amused me and interested me, with the understanding that at the same time I would begin taking the preliminary steps towards becoming a barrister. Now, several things happened which changed the course of my life. When I got my BA degree in history, I was the first of the year. I mean, I was the number one of all the graduates in history in that year.
No one is surprised.
Well, I was very surprised. My father was even more surprised. He was so worried that he wasn't even sure that I would pass.
What did he do, by the way?
He was a businessman.
Huh.
Yeah. But he thought I was spending too much time with my girlfriend and not enough with my studies. Anyway, I was number one, which carried with it a prize, the princely sum of £100, which in 1936, the year that I graduated, was a tidy sum of money.
I should think.
There was a condition.
Something to spend on girls.
Yeah. There was a condition attached that I had to start graduate studies. So I was perfectly willing, so I enrolled in the graduate studies program and did my first year and second year, and everything went nicely. Then my professor said to me, "You've now been studying the Middle East for 4 years. Don't you think it's time you saw the place?" And I said, "Yes, I would like to, but..." And This was at the depth of the Depression. Nobody had any money, including my family. And I could no more afford to go to the Middle East than I could go to the moon. And my professor understood that. And he said, well, I think we might be able to do something about that. And the next thing I was told was that I had been awarded a traveling studentship by the Royal Asiatic Society in the even more princely sum of £150. And with that I was able to spend 6 months in the Middle East, mainly in Egypt, but then also in Palestine, Syria, and Turkey. And then I went back to London, and to my utter astonishment, I was offered a job as an assistant lecturer, which is the lowest form of human life in the British academic community, at the salary of £250 a year. Naturally, a job is a job, particularly in Depression times, and I was delighted with it anyway. So I took that. The next thing that happened was that war broke out, and in due course I went into His Majesty's forces. I began in a tank regiment, and either because of my aptitude for languages or my ineptitude with tanks, or possibly both, I was transferred from tanks to intelligence. So I was transferred to military intelligence, and then after that I was transferred from military intelligence to secret intelligence. And I spent the rest of the war as part of MI6.
And what languages were you speaking at that point? Arabic, Turkish,
At that point
Persian?
I had already studied the 4 major Middle Eastern languages: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Hebrew.
And what made you come to America? A job offer?
It was a combination of circumstances. I came to America many times as a visitor. The very first time I came was on a lecture tour. After that I came for various visiting appointments at different universities. And then Princeton made me an offer that I couldn't refuse. It was a combined appointment at Princeton University and the Institute for Advanced Study, so that I would only be required to teach 1 semester a year and have the rest of the time available to me for doing my own research and writing. And as my life in London at the time was getting a bit complicated, I was just going through a rather unpleasant divorce. The idea of starting a new life in a new country was irresistibly attractive. A decision I have never ever regretted, not even for one moment.
You like America as a general proposition?
I do, yes. I mean, there are some things that I found not so much to my liking, but...
What are one or two of those?
Well, for example, coming from England, I was astonished at the level of discrimination against women in the academic world. I mean, when I was given my very first job, as I said before, as an assistant lecturer in the year 1938, the head of the University of London was a woman. That would have been inconceivable in this country. When I published my first article in a learned journal in the following year, 1939, the editor of the journal that published it was the professor of medieval economic history at Cambridge University. She was a woman. I mean, there were women professors at Oxford and Cambridge before there were women students at Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And I found that, although that has diminished since, I still found that there was a level of, I won't say hostility, but discrimination towards women students in American universities.
Another subject, in your experience, where is anti-Semitism more acute, Britain or America?
Well, I can't make a comparison about present-day Britain because I used to go every year, but I haven't been for many years now. And I'm told that there are changes. I would have said that at the time when I first came here, it was far more acute here than in England. I mean, in this country there were hotels that did not admit Jewish guests, something that would have been inconceivable in England. I mean, any hotel that practiced that sort of discrimination would have lost its license.
I hear quite a bit, I know you have too. It's not that I'm anti-Jewish, it's not that I'm anti-Semitic, it's that I'm anti-Israel. And the two aren't the same, you know. And I remember hearing Paul Johnson say once, yeah, people say that, but you scratch someone who's anti-Israel, You don't have to scratch very much till you reach the anti-Semite within. Is it your experience, your observation, that these two things, anti-Semitism and hostility to the Jewish state, go hand in hand?
Yes, but not necessarily. I mean, very often hostility to Israel is a disguised form of anti-Semitism, but not necessarily. I mean, Israel is a state which formulates policies and pursues and applies those policies, and it is perfectly legitimate to criticize, to disagree with those policies, if one thinks so. I think one can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. On the other hand, I would agree with you that very often it is a disguised form of anti-Semitism, but not necessarily so.
Did you know the Shah of Iran or have dealings with him?
Yes, I knew him fairly well. I was with him a number of times in his office.
Was he a despot?
Despot is a strong word. He was an authoritarian ruler, but I would not say he was a despot.
Was his downfall and the rise of Khomeini and that gang, is that the great tragedy, the turning point for the modern Middle East?
Yes, I think it was a great tragedy, and I think it could have been avoided. He did not receive the support to which I think he was entitled. I remember sitting with the Shah one day.
Excuse me, from the United States?
From the United States and the Western world in general. I remember sitting with the Shah in his office. As I said, I knew him quite well. And I remember he said to me, "Why do they keep attacking me?" And I said, "Who, Your Majesty?" And he said, "The New York Times, the Washington Post, the London Times, the Manchester Guardian, and Le Monde." He said, "The five weird sisters dancing around the doom of the West." He said, "Don't they know that I'm the best friend you have in this part of the world?" And I was seized, as used to happen to me when I was younger, by an imp of mischief. And I said, "Your Majesty, you must understand that our attitudes follow Marxist principles." And he looked astonished and he said, "Marxist principles?" I said, "Yes, not Karl, but Groucho." I said, "You remember Groucho?" He said, "Yes, of course." I said, "You may remember that at some point in one of the Marx Brothers films, Groucho says, 'I wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would have me as a member.' Well, we don't want the friendship of any group that wants our friendship." A lot of our policies are conducted on that principle. "Yes," he said, "I understand perfectly."
I once heard a Middle Eastern leader say that the best thing that could happen to us is the defeat, the downfall of the mullah's regime in Tehran. He said, think of an octopus. He said there are all sorts of tentacles. And in this case, tentacles include Hamas, the Syrian dictatorship, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah. You get rid of the head, in other words, the regime in Tehran, these tentacles will just wither away. They'll dry up. Do you subscribe to that?
As you put it, I think it's a little oversimplified. But broadly speaking, I think it's true. Nowadays, thanks to the wonders of modern communication, email, telephone, and all the rest of it, we can have a much better idea of what's really going on inside even dictatorships than previously. And I think there's no doubt at all that the regime in Iran is extremely unpopular in that country. It is cordially detested by the overwhelming majority of the Iranian population. There are two oppositions. There's the opposition within the regime, those who hate the present leadership or want to change it. And more important, there is the opposition to the regime. I'll give you some examples of how this comes out. When the American forces went into Iraq, and you see messages from a number of Iranians with the same text, which is obviously current in Iran. They said, "You should have tackled your problems in alphabetical order."
Iran before Iraq.
When we went into Afghanistan and the American planes were flying over Afghanistan, the story was that many Iranians put signs on their roofs in English, "This way, please." I mean, these stories tell you something.
After the elections in Iran in the summer of 2009, people rose up, protesters, democratic protesters in the streets. The regime cracked down viciously, of course.
Yes.
Could we America, we the West, have done more? It seems we stood by. Was there any more active role for us? Any active role for us to play?
Oh, there are a number of ways in which one can conduct political warfare. By radio, by television, even on the ground. There's a lot that can be done. And we didn't do a damn thing.
That's the way it seemed. Is it imperative that Iran be kept from a nuclear bomb? Or is that one other problem that we can live with and manage?
No, I think it is very urgent for this reason. You see, during the Cold War, both the West and the Soviets had nuclear weapons. They didn't use them because of what used to be known as MAD, mutual assured destruction. Each side knew that if they used the bomb, the other would use it and would mean destruction of both. Now, with these people, with their apocalyptic mindset, mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. I mean, in Islam, as in Christianity, as in Judaism, there is what you might call an end-of-time scenario. The end of time when the messianic figure, whoever he may be, either comes or returns, and the final battle takes place between the forces of good and the forces of evil.
The Iraq War is, of course, a big topic. We could spend all of our time on it. But I wanted to ask you just generally, were the United States and its allies right to go in and topple Saddam Hussein and stay and try to help build something?
Well, there are two Iraq wars. I mean, the first was necessary and inevitable. I mean, Saddam Hussein had committed a blatant act of aggression against another country. He had invaded, conquered, annexed Kuwait. It was not only justifiable, but it was necessary to do something to stop that. The second time, when the government did decide to go in, I think it was ill-advised. Whatever had to be done should have been done in cooperation with them, preferably, as I said before, by accepting their proposal for the recognition of their regime as the free government of Iraq. But no, instead, we chose to invade, and that led to a war and all sorts of consequences, which have been, on the whole, unfortunate.
I'm hearing more and more from people on various sides that the situation in Afghanistan is hopeless. It's a morass. The situation will never be straight. Do you feel a sense of futility about Afghanistan?
I feel very sad about Afghanistan. Many years ago, I spent several months in Afghanistan. I was there on a cultural mission, and I gave lectures in Kabul and traveled around the country and got to know the country fairly well. And I had a very, very positive impression of Afghanistan. It was in many respects very different from most of the countries in that region. I found the Afghans open, straightforward, direct. The British government had just signed a cultural treaty with what was then the Kingdom of Afghanistan. And having done that, they wondered what on earth to do next. And I was asked to go and spend a little while in Afghanistan to explore the possibilities of Anglo-Afghan cultural cooperation. And with this somewhat improbable assignment, I set off for Afghanistan, and that's a very interesting trip. Now, I'm sitting one day in a room with the Minister of Education, the head of the university, and various professors discussing, as I said, Anglo-Afghan cultural cooperation. And at one point, one of the young professors turned to me and said, the real question is this: would the British universities be prepared to recognize our degrees as equivalent? Well, I don't need to tell you the answer to that. And I was trying to think of a tactful answer, but I needn't have bothered. The Minister of Education turned to this young professor and said, "Don't be silly. How could they possibly recognize our degrees as equivalent?"
Interesting.
He knew. That was what Afghanistan was like in those days. People were free and fair and remarkably frank and open. What happened since is a terrible tragedy. I haven't been to Afghanistan since the liberation, but I've spoken to people who were there, and I'm told that it's totally transformed.
You know, or certainly have met Muammar Gaddafi, and by the time our interview,
I met him.
by the time our interview airs, he Who knows whether he'll be alive or dead, but he's alive for now as we're talking.
Mm-hmm.
Is he crazy or crazy like a fox? Is he simply bad to the bone? How do you assess Gaddafi? He seems a kind of madman, and yet he's hung on to power. He's dominated that country, ruled it as an absolute dictator since the 1960s.
Yes. I visited Libya once and was entertained by him in his tent in the desert. And I wouldn't say he's insane in the medical sense of that word. He's certainly eccentric. And he had certain passionate beliefs. The reason he invited me to go and talk to him was that he was deeply concerned, he said, deeply concerned at the close and friendly relationship between the House of Saud and the House of Bush. I asked him, well, why would that worry him? And he said, because the Saudis are persuading the Bushes that the real danger, the real enemy is Iran, he said. Iran is not a problem. Iran is not important. Your real danger, your real enemy is Saudi Arabia. That is the source of all the dangers, of all the terrorists, of all the violence. Well, he wasn't entirely wrong in that, but he was largely wrong. That was the mission he wanted me to carry out, which of course I did not do. And that was the reason I was invited.
When he was president, did Mr. Bush, that is George W. Bush, the 43rd president, did he reach out to you, consult you?
Well, I wouldn't say he reached out to consult me, but I did have contact with people in the White House, yes.
And he has been out of office now for a couple of years. What is your general assessment of Bush as foreign policy president, in particular with regard to the Middle East?
Difficult to say. I think he did some good things, some bad things. I would certainly not agree that it was a series of disastrous mistakes. But what I think should have been done, all presidents, past and present, are making the same mistake, and that is in not realizing that what we have to do is cultivate the opposition and carry on effective political warfare against these tyrannical regimes.
When you say the opposition, you mean democratic elements?
I mean the democratic opposition within those countries. It does exist.
We were talking about Bush once, you and I, and you recounted something that Harold Nicholson says in his memoirs. Do you recall that? Nicholson joins the diplomatics.
Nicholson talks of talking to a very senior British diplomat with largely Middle Eastern experience. And someone asked this man, how can you get to understand what is at the back of the Oriental's mind when you talk to him? Remember that in American usage, Oriental means Far East, but in British usage, it includes the Middle East. The diplomat replied, it's useless to try. You can't, and it's probably of no great interest or significance anyway. What you can do and must do is leave him in no doubt at all about what is in your mind. And I think that's very important. I think that's a profoundly accurate statement. It is important to be clear and unequivocal, to let them know what we mean, that we mean what we say and we say what we mean, and what will be the consequences of ignoring that.
I like to turn now to Israel, and I'm reminded of something that Charles Krauthammer said and says. We were talking once about the survival of Israel, the question of the survival of Israel. And he said there are two important factors: the will of the Israelis to survive, to fight for their country, their right to exist, and the support of the United States. And as long as those conditions are fulfilled, okay. What do you think about the prospects for Israel?
I would say the Israeli prospects for survival are pretty good. They're certainly not 100%, but I would say they're good. And my reason for that is the weakness of their enemies. The situation has changed dramatically with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, until then, the Middle East was a contested area between the West and the Nazis, between the West and the Soviets, and so on. And that gave a special importance to the Middle East and gave all sorts of opportunities to Middle Eastern governments. Now that has come to an end. the Soviet Union no longer exists. The Cold War has come to an end. The United States is visibly losing interest in the Middle East. People talk about American imperialism. The term might not unreasonably be applied to the processes by which the original 13 states increased to the present 50. But as applied to American policy in the Middle East, it is ludicrous. It shows a complete lack of understanding of what imperialism means or what America means. American interest in the Middle East is now minimal and diminishing. Now, the only thing that remains important in the Middle East for the outside world is oil. Now, sooner or later, oil will be either exhausted or superseded. That end is inevitable. Now, when that happens, what will be the situation? A report published by an Arab committee recently showed that the total exports of the entire Arab world, other than fossil fuels, amount to less than those of Finland. In other words, apart from oil, they have nothing. And the chances are that when oil is either exhausted or superseded, the whole area will relapse into insignificance. That doesn't apply to Israel, which has sometimes been referred to as the startup nation. Now, if the Israelis can manage to survive until that point is reached, then I think their further history would be safe.
Who are the prime ministers of Israel you've admired? Or who have been especially good ones? I'm thinking of Golda, Begin, Sharon, Netanyahu, Rabin. Any of them you want to, I'm sure you knew them all. Anyone you want to comment?
I couldn't say that I knew them all. I hadn't met them. The only one that I knew reasonably well was Golda. I had a great respect for her. But on one really serious occasion, she disagreed.
Disagreed with you?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
I used to visit Egypt quite frequently. And I was there during the period when Egypt was becoming increasingly a Soviet colony. I'm old enough to remember Egypt in the days of the British Empire at its height. And the Soviet presence in Egypt was more blatant, more obvious, more offensive than the British presence had ever been. And as I say, I'm old enough to seem both able to make the experience. The point was well made by an Egyptian friend of mine at the time, who said both the British and the Russians treated Egypt as their cow. He said the difference was that the British wanted milk and the Russians wanted beef. Now, the Russian presence, the Soviet presence, was really becoming offensive. And Sadat was very aware of this. And he felt he had to do something to get rid of them. And you may remember that at a certain point, with great courage, he ordered the Russians out. There was no certainty that they would go. They might easily have taken over, but they decided to go temporarily. And he turned for help to the United States, obviously. And the Carter administration responded with the Vance-Gromyko agreement, dividing the world into spheres of influence, and in effect giving Egypt back to the Russians.
Not what Sadat had in mind.
Not what Sadat had in mind. Sadat then decided that the only hope is to try and make peace with the Israelis. Now, as I say, I was in Egypt at the time. I knew this. And he sent a number of messages to Israel. One of them I carried. Not from Sadat personally, I didn't meet him, but from various members of his senior staff. The message was that Egypt was ready to make peace, but they needed some sign or gesture from the Israeli side. I went to Israel, I met with Golda Meir and Dayan, told them this message. Golda Meir didn't believe me. She said I had allowed myself to be fooled by the Egyptians.
How about Dayan?
He did believe me. And they both refused for the same reason. She because she didn't believe me, and he because he did believe me. He said if we make peace, we have to give back Sinai, and rather have peace. Sinai, no peace, and peace, and no Sinai. But Sadat's intention was to make peace at that time already. I have no doubt about that at all.
And Begin and his team were receptive.
Yes, surprisingly so.
Now, Sadat's successor, Mubarak, is gone.
Yes.
And some think that the Egyptian-Israeli peace is in question. Do you regard it as in question?
It may be, yes. We don't yet know which way Egypt is going. There are people in the West who keep on insisting on free and fair elections. I think this is lunacy. I mean, free and fair elections, Western style, is a Western practice deriving from Western history. That's not their way of doing things. And if we insist on free and fair elections, the probability is that the Muslim Brothers or something like them would win and take over Egypt, which would be catastrophic.
Professor, which is truer? Mubarak was an Egyptian patriot who for all those years kept the extremists, kept the radicals at bay. Or he was a dictator, even if a so-called presidential dictator, who retarded Egypt, who kept Egypt from a democratic path it might have pursued. Which is more true?
Well, the two are not mutually exclusive. But I think the first one is nearer to the truth. I think he did preside over some positive changes in Egypt.
You respect Mubarak?
Yes, I think so, yes. I mean, he was not a dictator in the way in which we use that term of Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin.
Here's something I'd like to put to you. I put it once to an Egyptian friend of mine. We were talking about differences between the Middle East and the West, and we were talking about Saudi Arabia in particular. And I said, plenty of Saudis travel. We have a great many Saudi students and Saudi professors here in the United States. And Saudis see that in the West, in America, in Europe, there's a mosque on virtually every block. And they know that in their country, churches and synagogues are forbidden. Are they embarrassed by this difference? Do they think it's strange? Are they made uncomfortable by this imbalance? And my friend said, I doubt it. They probably think it's the natural order of things. What do you say to that?
I think for the majority that is probably true. Certainly some are embarrassed by it and are well aware of the difference between the freedom of the West and the lack of freedom in the East. But for the average man in the street, theirs is the true faith and the others are false. And it is natural that the true faith should have privileges.
An amazing thing, that this imbalance.
Yeah. Well, it's not amazing. I mean, that was the general attitude of almost everybody for the most of human history.
I guess so. The education you had in Middle Eastern affairs and other things was very, very good. Is the kind of education you had obtainable today?
Yes and no. On the one hand, there are a number of universities where there's good instruction available in the languages and the history of the Middle East. On the other hand, there is a kind of political orthodoxy that is being enforced in the profession, which I find very alarming.
As I remember, you were one of the founders of MESA, the Middle East Studies
Yes.
Association.
I was indeed, yes.
And what happened to that organization? Nothing good, I assume.
Oh, it has been nothing good. No, it has been taken over by the disciples of Edward Said.
And remind us who Said was. And I quoted Paul Johnson earlier. I think I'll quote him again now. He describes Said, author of the book Orientalism, as the most destructive intellectual of his generation.
Mm. You know, we all tend to judge others by ourselves. It's a natural human thing. Said was an Arab who was a professor of English. And he assumed that an Englishman who's a professor of Arabic would have the same attitude to his subject as he had to his. Mm-hmm. Do I make myself clear?
It's somewhat subtle. Was Said cordial to you?
No, we only met once, I think, and he was distant. And on paper, he was very offensive.
He thought that you were some sort of agent of Western imperialism
That's
in
right.
the Middle East. This brings to mind how one cares about the Middle East, cares enough to study it, learn about it. And I wonder if you'd tell me again about that preface to a translation of one of your books. Didn't the Muslim Brotherhood translate and circulate one of your books? And the man who wrote the preface, I think, paid you a compliment which relates to this matter of Said and his view of you.
Right. One of my studies was a little book. You might call it a booklet. It was translated into Arabic and published, to my utter astonishment, by the Muslim Brothers. This is not the kind of customer I would have expected. But they translated this into Arabic and published it with a brief introductory note saying, the writer of which says, I don't know who this man is, but one thing is clear. He is either a candid friend or an honest enemy, but in either case, one who disdains to falsify the truth. I was very happy with that.
You once made a comparison to me of what happened in Middle East studies in this country and probably elsewhere, and what happened in Chinese studies. And many of the Chinese studies departments were taken over by Maoists, or in any case, those sympathetic to Mao. And the Middle East departments, they were taken over by whom? By apologists for Yasser Arafat? And
well, mainly by the Saudis.
And so money plays a role here.
Exactly. Oh, money plays a very important role in this.
And does this money buy off scholars, or are they sympathetic in the first place and happy to take the money regardless? What's the effect of this money in your
field? Well, the money goes to the institutions. You know, it tends to, at the very least, it tends to make people cautious. You don't want to offend your benefactors. I mean, the extent to which Middle Eastern studies are funded by Middle Eastern governments is alarming, I think.
It leads to a kind of corruption of scholarship, a corruption of thought,
well, corruption
of teaching.
is a strong word. I wouldn't go that far.
Adulteration of...
If you like. Yes.
Yeah. I think the London School of Economics took $120 million, something like that.
Yes.
From the Gaddafi family.
Yeah.
You have co-founded a different organization as a kind of antidote to the first organization you helped found.
Right. Yes, the first organization which I helped to found, as I said, has been taken over. Mm. So some of us got together and we decided to start a new one, which is called ASMES, A-S-M-E-S, Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. And I'm glad to say it's doing quite well. We already have a large number of members holding meetings.
You're making inroads then?
Yes.
I suppose that knowledge of the Middle East and understanding of the Middle East for all of us is more critical than it has ever been.
And our organization has no political allegiances.
Mm. I've heard it said, I don't know if by you, but heard it said by others, that the Arab world or the Muslim world in general could use a Sakharov figure, could use a writer like Solzhenitsyn, could use some glorious dissident or dissidents to show the way.
There have been such figures, but they have disappeared.
In other words, they've been done away with by the regimes that rule them.
Or they have learned to be silent.
But can the West do various things to help these people, or must we just remain on the sidelines?
No, I think we could do much more than we do to help them. I mean, there are, particularly in our time, with all the wonders of modern communication at our disposal, there's so much more that we could do than we are doing. And we are doing practically nothing. Mm-hmm. There are opposition movements in these dictatorships, but we do nothing to help them, we do nothing to encourage them, we do nothing to support them.
A quick chat about American presidents, if you don't mind. Which presidents have understood the Middle East or dealt with the Middle East sensibly, in your opinion?
Well, the first name that comes to mind is Reagan.
And how about his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, who has spent much of his career in the Middle East and in Middle East associated activities?
Well, Jimmy Carter, I'm afraid, had to handle the Iran crisis, mm-hmm. and did not make a good job of it.
And if you could control American policy, let's say, or make strong recommendations, what would you do, just generally speaking? What would you do that we're not doing presently? Well, you already mentioned the support of the Democrats where you can find them.
Well, that is the thing I think which we should be doing. That is to give help and encouragement to the forces of freedom in the Muslim world, and they do exist. There are such people, there are such organizations even, and we could help them in a lot of different ways by providing them with media communication, for example.
You hear people say that these people shouldn't have some kind of American taint, that any sort of association with or help from the United States would taint them and hurt them where they are. Any truth to that?
That is both true and false. In some contexts, it would be a taint. In others, it would be a recommendation.
How about the Assad dictatorship in Syria? Any chance that we'll see the overthrow of that anytime soon?
I'm cautiously optimistic about that.
Is Hezbollah in Lebanon tameable at all?
I don't think so, no. No.
Always be a terror group?
These are real fanatics of the worst kind.
In Jordan, do they have the best government possible or conceivable now, this monarchy they have? It's maybe something you and I wouldn't want to live under, but is it the least oppressive or restrictive of the states in that area?
I think so, yes. I used to visit Jordan every year on the days of the late King Hussein, with whom I had a very friendly relationship. But I hear good reports about Jordan, how things are developing there. It's, I hope it could serve as a model for the rest of the region.
You hear some people say, maybe too cheekily, that Jordan is a Palestinian state. Is that too cheeky or flip a thing to say?
It depends what you mean by Palestinian. I mean, the name Palestine was, until 1948, was only used by the Jews. The Jews there called themselves Palestinians, their organizations Palestinian. The Arabs rejected it, rejected the whole idea of Palestine, very logically, because when the British created a separate entity there and dredged its name from the Middle Ages and called it Palestine, the Arabs objected because they said, you're creating a separate entity. This is part of the greater Arab East. At the very least, it's part of greater Syria. But more than that, it's part of the greater Arab world. And the Arabs rejected the name Palestinian, refused to call themselves Palestinian, until the establishment of the State of Israel. And then, only then, looking around for something else, they adopted the name Palestinian. It's remarkable, for example, that if you look at Arabic literature, which is enormously rich in history, the Arabs were always interested in history, and the historical literature in Arabic from the Middle Ages onwards is enormously rich and varied. The first history of Palestine in Arabic was a textbook produced by order of the British government in Palestine for use as a textbook in schools. I mean, they never thought of Palestine as an entity. It was part of a greater whole.
There's much talk of a Palestinian state.
Yes.
Of two states.
But in that sense, there is a Palestinian state, because Palestine was on both sides of the Jordan. It was a decision of the British government as mandatory power to separate the East Bank, rename it Jordan, and establish a separate monarchy there. But previously, Palestine was always understood to include both the East Bank and the West Bank. So in that sense, there is already a Palestinian state, but not, of course, as the term is used nowadays.
Yes, and those Arabs referred to as Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Is it your view, is it your feeling that most Palestinians, a majority, would like peaceful coexistence with Israel? Or do you think a majority considers all of the former Palestine theirs? And do they want the whole enchilada, so to speak, or are they willing to have two states and live peacefully side by side?
Certainly there are some who are willing to have two states and live peacefully side by side, and their numbers are increasing. But certainly not all would share that view. What the proportions are, it's impossible to say, because we have no reliable way of assessing it. But there are, from time to time, interesting expressions of opinion. For example, I read recently a statement by a prominent Palestinian intellectual who said the only place in the entire Middle East where an Arab can live a decent life with reasonable comfort and freedom of expression is as a second-class citizen of the Jewish state. And in a sense, that's true. The Israeli Arabs are citizens of Israel, and they enjoy a standard of living and a measure of freedom without parallel anywhere else in the Arab world. It's remarkable, for example, that when there were negotiations about redrawing the lines, there was some suggestion that the area known as the Triangle, which is part of Israel, but is solidly Arab. And some Israelis suggested that the Triangle should be transferred from Israel to the new Arab state, and there were immediately violent and vociferous protests from the Triangle. They didn't want to leave Israel and become part of a Palestinian state, and for good reason.
This term war on terror is somewhat controversial.
Well, I don't like it, to be frank. I think it's misleading. I mean, my most vivid recollections of being in England in 1940, we were at war, but we didn't say we were engaged in a war against bomber aircraft and submarines. Terror is a tactic, it's not an enemy.
Well, I suppose the term war on terror is less euphemistic than the term overseas contingency operations, which is what the present administration uses.
Yes. In any case, it's an evasive title.
War on terror, that is.
Yes.
Well, what ought we to call this conflict or this series of conflicts we're in?
But I think war on terrorism would be better than, again, war on terror.
War on terrorism.
Yes. I think that would be better. But it's not only war on terrorism. We have to indicate where the terrorism originates.
No shorthand phrase really suits, does it?
No.
Even the Cold War was at times a ridiculous term in that there were so many hot wars during the so-called Cold War in Korea and Vietnam and so on.
I mean, it's important that we shouldn't present it as a war against Islam. Because the enemy is not Islam as such. The enemy is a certain group within Islam, whom for some Muslims represent a perversion of authentic Islam. But nevertheless, they have positions of power and in some places dominance. That is what we have to cope with.
What should we call them? Extremists, radicals, diehards?
I wouldn't say diehards, but extremists, yes, radicals, yes, fundamentalists, if you like.
Are these people who simply won't coexist with other nations or other types of government or other religions?
Oh, they will coexist provided that they are dominant and the rest are subordinate.
How do you explain such a mindset, such an attitude? Where did it come from? The desire to rule not only, let's say, Syria or Lebanon, but the desire to rule Europe and the United States. It seems so fanciful and fantastic.
It comes from a basic worldview that they are the fortunate recipients of God's final message to humanity, which it is their duty not to keep selfishly to themselves, but to share with the rest of humanity, bringing it to them by force if necessary, and removing whatever obstacles that may be in the way.
Are they a minority within Islam, within the Muslim world, a small minority?
I don't think so, no. I think that is a widely prevalent view. But it's only a small minority that actually want to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. You mean act on these so-called fundamentalist beliefs
exactly.
and rule others?
I mean, the basic doctrine is that they have the final revelation. Theirs is the true faith. Others are at best incomplete and superseded, at worst false. And it is their duty to continue the holy war until that faith is brought to all humanity and becomes dominant. And others either accept it or accept the status of subordination.
You sometimes hear the term moderate Muslim, and I know Muslims who very much object to this term, moderate Muslim, and it makes them sound maybe not believing enough. What should we call people who are interested in, let's say, decent governance and a life at peace with one's neighbors?
I would be tempted to call them authentic Muslims.
I have a final question for you, and it's kind of a grand one, maybe too big a one. I hear increasingly from people, from Americans, you know, the Middle East, the Arab world, the Muslim world, It takes up too much of our mental space. It takes up too much of our conversation. It's too much in the news. I'm tired of hearing about it. We should just wash our hands of it. I don't want to hear about another Middle Eastern problem again forever. I've had enough of the Middle East. As Ryan Crocker, the American diplomat, puts it, people are ready for the Iraq movie or for the Middle East movie to be over. They want to walk out and maybe see another movie, which is understandable. What do you say to this attitude that we should just let, we meaning Americans, the West, should let Middle Easterners stew in their own juices? We've given enough, we've done enough, blood and treasure, let them sort out their own problems. Is that unrealistic?
I think it's dangerous. Remember, with modern weaponry and modern resources, there are all sorts of dangerous possibilities. On the other hand, it may be less dangerous than the alternatives.
Professor Lewis, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Over the years, I've found that one of the great treats in life is to talk with Bernard Lewis. I hope you've found this too. I'm Jay Nordlinger. Thanks for joining us on the Human Parade.